Hi everybody, we're back for the second part of our last class on July 2nd. Now that we have finished talking about incidents in the life of a slave girl, moving to The Awakening by Kate Chopin. If you remember, we began the semester with Kate Chopin talking about the story of an hour, and I had indicated that I wanted the class to be circular so that we would end with Kate Chopin as well. And I've been putting the text in chronological order, deliberately so, after we had read the story of an hour, that is, just so that you could see the progression. And obviously we get stronger and stronger women as the semester progresses, and part of that is an indicator of the changes going on throughout the time period. That said, The Awakening was considered to be so outlandish for the expectations of the time period that it was banned, and Chopin was basically ostracized after writing The Awakening. She was blacklisted. Now, she herself had lived a rather unorthodox life. She didn't care for parties. Think about the world of persuasion and how you're supposed to have parties, and how Emily Dickinson was in direct contrast to the idea of socializing. She would spend her time reading literature. Think about how Jane Eyre starts her tale, and that she's beginning to read books, and how we talked about incidents in the life of a slave girl, and how we talked about the cult of true womanhood, and that ultimately the dangers of reading. And then, of course, in the idea of incidents in the life of a slave girl, why slaves were not allowed to read and write is because reading and writing leads to power. And power leads to the possibility of enacting political and social change. Chopin smoked cigars, which even in today's world might raise a few eyebrows. She walked alone. And again, if you'll remember the cult of true womanhood, the idea that a woman shouldn't be left to her own devices. You never know what kind of trouble she would get herself into. She insisted on privacy. She dressed unconventionally. And we had talked about how dress reform was huge during this time period because clothing oftentimes served as a way to physically restrain female. And of course, it's a great example of that. Something that was so tight that it was almost impossible to breathe, let alone move. She ran the family plantation after her husband's death. According to all of the scholarship that exists, she had a very good relationship with her husband. And that said, what the texts that she oftentimes writes about are females entrapped in relationship, whether that happens to be a reflection of her true feelings with her marriage with her husband, or her observations with other women in their relationships and how her relationship stood in contrast. What we're going to see in The Awakening are themes of self-assertion. I would argue that we've seen that all semester long. Repressed sexuality, and that's probably why this text was considered to be so scandalous. After all, we're still in the Victorian period, which was very it was very conservative sexually, and the idea that a woman needed to retain purity above all else and didn't have any kind of sexual desire. And also there was a theme of being independent. And what we see in The Awakening is that our main character, Edna, experiences an intellectual, an emotional, and a physical awakening. And again, that idea of physical awakening, while it's been suggested somewhat in some of the earlier texts, we haven't really had a text that's dealt with sexuality in such a direct way. And the book, a novella, isn't quite as long as isn't quite as long as a novel, definitely longer than a short story. It's divided up into separate books. So I thought what I would do is I would draw your attention, and you can see this in the notes, to elements within each of the books that reinforce this idea of Edna's awakening and some of the ways that Kate Chopin was rebelling against the conventions of the time. And in book one, we get immediately a caged bird. And of course, we've talked about the idea of birds representing females and the cage representing perhaps the home, which could serve as a kind of place of entrapment. A bird can escape from the cage. A bird is oftentimes kept as a showpiece in a cage. So there are lots of parallels with that and female. This caged bird is speaking an incomprehensible language. The idea that no one can really understand what female is saying, specifically what Edna is saying. And it's actually saying, get out. in another language. And this is something that perhaps could serve as a kind of foreshadowing about what Edna is going to want and need to get out of this repressive system. At the very beginning, she's swimming without her wedding rings. This is supposed to be a representation of freedom, that when she's in the water, she experiences freedom. And the water is oftentimes likened to the idea of being back in the womb, a place where she can rebirth or awaken again. Water is also very cleansing as well. In book 3, we find out how Mr. Pontellier is very disappointed that his wife is not interested in his concerns, and also is not more attentive to the children. And again, think about the cult of true womanhood and the idea that female should sacrifice herself for the male in relationship. And that he actually looked forward to leaving his family for the excitement of work in the city. So basically they're vacationing and he's there during weekends, and then he leaves to work in the city. And this is an opportunity for him to have a different environment and to challenge himself emotionally and intellectually. All of the things that women were deprived of, or most women were deprived of during this time period. To give a contrast, in book 4, Madame Ratignolle, another female, she thinks it's risky behavior to select a bonbon that might be too rich and hurt her. Definitely we see that in contrast to Edna and some of the risky behavior that Edna is going to engage in as the novel progresses. In book 5 and 6, we're told about the sea, how it's this kind of seductive force going in and out. So there's sexual imagery there as well. And that the sea can cleanse, rejuvenate, caress, and offer freedom and escape. And again, also can be symbolic of the womb and symbiotic fluid. And then this is where Edna begins to realize her position as an independent being. The episode where Edna learns how to swim in chapter 10 is particularly important because it's able to show her independence and power to herself and to others. And note that in that episode, all of the men take credit for their being able to teach her how to swim rather than giving her credit for learning how to swim. In book 7, Edna removes her collar and opens her dress at the front. And that very subtle move is supposed to be a symbol of freedom. And the idea that Edna is beginning to experience the pangs of needing freedom. She's got a passionless marriage to Mr. Pontellier, and she's fond in an uneven way of her children, which is not the way a mother should be speaking about her children. A mother's supposed to be talking about unconditional love. So here what we've got is an Edna who very much is in direct contrast, and perhaps is much more honest than any of the women in her time period. In book 9, Mademoiselle Reisz, who serves in contrast to many of the women in this book. She's unmarried and she's basically someone who embraces the arts, and she's a loner. But one of the things she does is that she plays Chopin. There's a little bit of a pun here. We're talking about Chopin the musician as opposed to Chopin the artist, who is the author of this particular piece. Edna is struck by the passion of the music. This is a character who's completely overcome with emotion and passion as the text progresses. And not only that, she acts on those urges. And book 11, Edna and her husband have a battle of wills over who will go inside the house first. Mr. Pontellier seems to win that particular battle as he stays outside until the point that she gets tired enough that she retreats first. But we'll see that that's just a prelude, because ultimately Edna is going to be fighting battles against him that she will clearly win. In book 13 is where Edna begins to truly have her first sensual awakening. When she's taking a nap, stretching out in a bed, she's beginning to feel and observe her body for the first time, and then she awakes hungry, and that's a literal hunger, that she wants food, but it's also a figurative hunger as well, and that she's hungry for life, she's hungry for sensuality, she's hungry for power, she's hungry for independence. And then in book 15, we find out that Edna is upset that Robert is leaving town. They've been spending a good amount of time together, and it turns out that Edna and Robert are developing an emotional relationship with one another. She realizes initially that she's infatuated with him, which is a feeling that she's had before. As the book progresses, she realizes that it's much more serious than infatuation. And he feels the same for her as the book progresses. In book 16, Edna says she would never sacrifice herself to anyone, even her children, although she said she would give up her life for them. And the distinction between giving up one's life and giving up one's emotional core. It's something that we saw in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, where we saw where Linda was able to give up her physical freedom, but still able to retain her emotional freedom. In book 17, Edna refuses to take callers on Tuesdays afternoons. And again, think about how important it would be for social decorum to do something like that. When we think about the world of the Rochesters and Jane Eyre, and we think about the world of the Elliots and Persuasion. And Mr. Pontellier, as she's basically talking about how she refuses to accept callers and follow the schedule and the routine, he keeps seasoning his bland soup. That bland soup is supposed to be a representation of his bland life. And at that point, Edna tries to throw away her wedding ring, but the maid returns it to her. Again, a symbol about how she's trying to escape from the entrapment of marriage. In book 18, I believe it is. Yep. Edna says she doesn't envy the domestic harmony of the Ratignolis, who are supposed to be representations of the perfect couple, because that isn't necessarily what Edna wants. Again, if you think about something like Persuasion and the Crofts and being a childless couple and wanting to be together purely because they enjoy each other's company, not because they feel some sort of a need for social or convention. I think that you can see that in Edna's thinking. Except that as Edna goes on, she realizes that relationship may not be the answer at all. Spoiler alert there. If you haven't gotten to the ending of the book, you might want to finish reading it before you see the rest of this presentation on the awakening. Mr. Pontellier is shocked and angered that Edna is disregarding her duties as a wife and a mother. His first thought is that she's mentally unstable. That was not an unusual place to go, that a woman was seen as mad if she didn't fit into the conventions of society. It's one of the reasons why Mr. Rochester's wife, Bertha, is so interesting, because we're not supposed to necessarily sympathize with Bertha, and yet we can't help but think of Bertha as a representation of female that is entrapped. In book 13, in book 21, Edna learns that Robert has been writing letters to her, to Mademoiselle Reisz. In other words, Robert's feelings for her are similar to the feelings that she has for him. The difficulty, of course, is that Edna is a married woman. And then in book 22, Mr. Pontellier, who's so concerned about his wife's mental state, visits a physician. And the reason why is because his wife is making him feel, quote, uncomfortable, unquote. And the doctor wonders if a man is involved, but out of decorum, he doesn't state his concerns out loud, because, of course, decorum is of ultimate importance in this society and time period. One of the things that Chopin writes about is local Creole society. So not only are we getting a representation of the United States, but we're also getting a representation of Creole society as well in Louisiana, as well as other southern states. In book 23, Edna says she's happy to have her husband at work so often, because if he were home, they wouldn't have anything to say to one another, which illustrates that their union is not one of emotional and intellectual equals. Their union was much more of the match union, the right match that we had talked about with Persuasion. In book 24, Edna's father thinks Mr. Pontellier is being too lenient with Edna. Again, sort of illustrating what we were talking about in The Cult of True Womanhood, about how first father and then husband basically served as owner of female. Meanwhile, Edna is enjoying her solitude and the leisure she has to read. Again, the importance of statements about being able to read and write, and what does that mean for female. And then in book 25, Edna starts spending time with a new male friend, Mr. Arabin, who's known for having affairs, and which is exactly what she ends up having with him. And her guilt is not about her husband. Her guilt is, what would Robert, the man that she has true feelings for, feel about her new relationship? So once we get to this point, perhaps we can understand why Chopin's text was considered to be so scandalous. In book 26, Edna decides to go off on her own, to rent her own house and move into a small house called what she thinks of as a pigeon house. Again, more bird imagery. Around the corner that she can afford on her own with the small inheritance and income she generates from selling her sketches. The idea of economic independence for female. And what does that afford for female? That economic independence. The idea that Edna leaves her husband, and his main concern is what will the neighbors think, that they're experiencing some sort of financial hardship. So he creates a long, convoluted tale to try to convince individuals that the reason why they need to vacate their house, because he's decided he needs to vacate it as well if she has vacated it, is because renovations will be occurring. So that's his way of saving face. Think of Sir Eliot, if you will, Persuasion, and his concern with maintaining appearances as well. At this particular point, Edna knows that her character would be viewed as wicked, but that's not going to stop her actions. So she continues on with Arobin and consummates their relationship. But she's pleased to hear that Robert is returning as well, and hopeful that perhaps there's a way that she and Robert could have some sort of a connection. In book 30, Edna turns 29, and I'd argue 29 is a pivotal life stage, especially for female. Once female enters into 30, even in 2020, there's a shift in thinking about the transition from youth, which represents bloom and beauty, to the idea of maturity, and that oftentimes female isn't given or afforded the respect associated with older age that male is. That said, we find out that once Mr. Pontellier finds out about his wife's intentions, he decides to create that convoluted tale, and Robert returns to town in book 33. Robert sees Arobin's picture at Edna's house and is jealous, and she explains that this was just someone that she happened to be sketching. But when we get to 36, Edna kisses Robert, and then they admit finally their love for one another. This is when, shortly thereafter, Edna is summoned to Madame Ratignolle's for another birth, Madame Ratignolli being one of these mother women, getting pregnant pretty much on a schedule. And as she's giving birth, Edna goes even though she's not really needed. And one of the reasons why Madame Ratignolli wants Edna there is because Madame Ratignolli wants to tell Edna to think about her responsibility to her children. In other words, Madame Ratignolli is suspicious, as others are as well, that Edna has basically decided that she can no longer support her family. And that means one thing in terms of her relationship with her husband, but that means completely something else in terms of her relationship with her children, which is why this is a particularly difficult text to read. We're supposed to feel sympathy and empathy for Edna, much like we did for Mrs. Mallard in The Story of an Hour. The distinction, however, is that Mrs. Mallard had no children, and Edna does. And there is a responsibility from parent to child. We talked about that with Frankenstein, and what happens when parent negates that responsibility. So you can see that Edna is a much more complex character than many of the other characters that we've read thus far. In some ways, Edna might be a little bit more realistic than many of the characters we've read so far because of all of the facets to a personality. When Edna finally returns home, and this is 38, when Edna finally returns home to come back to Robert after she's witnessed Madame Ratignolli's birth, Robert is gone, leaving a note saying that he needs to leave because he loves her. He understands that if he would have a relationship with her, she would need to sacrifice too much. And then finally, at the ending of the novella, Edna talks about how she cannot sacrifice herself for her children, and that in fact, even if Robert had stayed, she ultimately couldn't have a relationship with him, because having a relationship with any man or any individual would mean that she would have to sacrifice a level of her independence and autonomy, and she wasn't able to do that. And basically, at this point, she undresses, she goes into the sea naked, the idea that she's a newborn returning back to the womb, or perhaps that she's throwing off all of the convention of her life, and she swims until she's exhausted. We aren't told specifically what happens, but the assumption is that if she swims out as far as she can and she's exhausted, she drowns. In other words, she commits suicide. Again, there are parallels with Mrs. Mallard in the story of An Hour and Joy That Kills, whether this was a willed suicide when Mrs. Mallard realized that she was going to lose her independence, or whether this was just shock and grief over the loss of her independence, or as I suggested, a combination of all of them. But when Edna says she cannot sacrifice herself for her children, she understands that if she continued to live, she would have to continue to live a false life, one in which she could not be true to herself. Therefore, she commits suicide. And you can decide for yourself as a reader whether that's a noble action because she refuses to compromise her ideals, knowing that society is never going to change. Or do you see this as an act of cowardice, much like we talked about with Victor, that there is a responsibility once you create life to nurture that life, regardless of your own position in the world. So that gives you an overview of the awakening. What I thought I would do is that I would post our attendance question next class on Tuesday for the discussion forum. Again, I'll ask something about the awakening that doesn't necessarily require a right or wrong answer, but that will be your last attendance mark. I'll also post our final exam in our Tuesday class, the 2nd. Or no, I'm sorry, on our Tuesday class, that happens to be on the 7th. And then you will have 48 hours to answer the questions on the final exam. It'll be an essay exam, and you'll have choice within each of the sections in terms of which essay to choose. And everything that you have not yet submitted, I will accept up until the 9th of July at 9 a.m. So if it turns out that you're behind with a journal or a revision or a paper, I'll take it grudgingly, but I'll take it because I understand the kinds of challenges that all of us are facing. I can't thank you enough for taking this class. In this particularly challenging time, I have nothing but admiration for the idea that in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of great racial and political tension, you still have enough fortitude and desire to educate yourself. And I hope you educate others over the course of your lifetime. So I hope you're well. I'm well. I will post something in text rather than in video for our next class. Take care.